post-colonial studies. Okay. And asked them to try to put mechanics onto these themes that we had gotten from Puerto Rico. So the workshop led to two different prototypes. One of them was this one, which was about the debt crisis in Puerto Rico. So in 2016, the Obama administration proposed a federal law that was established that created an austerity plan for Puerto Rico, so they would be able to pay off their big debt, which isn't a national debt since they're not a nation, so they can't go to the IMF and get debt relief, but they're also not a state, so they can't declare bankruptcy, for instance. But the problem with this law is that it also installed an oversight committee that can veto any political decisions on a financial basis that the local government is making. So basically, whatever little political independence Puerto Rico had was removed, and the debt will take a very, very long time to pay off, even with this payment plan that is called Promesa. So basically, it's just a way of exerting power over the territory and not really helping out. So after the workshop, we developed the idea further. So to begin with, it was just kind of a card game, sort of a spinning plates mechanic where you were trying to make sure that you have all the resources you need and still try to pay off the loan, and sort of shown how hard that would be. But at one point in time, we decided to try out a dexterity mechanic that sort of became the core of the game. So the way it works now is that there is a tarp in the middle of the board that represents the FEMA tarps that we saw instead of roofs on a lot of buildings when we were there. We were there 9 months after Hurricane Maria. So basically, the roofs had blown off the buildings, and they still hadn't been able to replace them. The traffic lights in San Juan were still not working, etc. And there are still some of those tarps up there. So we have a silicone component in the middle that you have to place the depth on. That's those gems on top of it, and then through different actions, you have to simulate a process where you get rid of the debt through political means rather than trying to pay it off. After we had the prototype done, I contacted an artist in Puerto Rico called Rosa Colon. She is best known as a comic book maker. She has won a Will Eisner Award for a book, an anthology she was in called Puerto Rico Strong. And this is some of the early illustration ideas she had for the board. This is what it looks in its final form. And I think it really brings something to the game that a local artist who, this happened during pandemic, so she had more time than we had hoped. She was supposed to be a visiting artist at MIT, but she had to stay in Puerto Rico. But she had some time to travel around, take some pictures of different places for reference, and create her own map of Puerto Rico that is very different than the tourist maps that most people are familiar with. So I've gotten comments from Puerto Rican students who have play tested that they're so happy how small San Juan is, and so happy that the place that they are from actually is on the map, because it usually never is. Okay, so to round this off, I wanted to say something about this core mechanic, the pushing of the tarp with all the gems on it. It is very frustrating, I admit, but as many of you know who are into game design, frustration can be a good motivator for gameplay. But it also says something about the current state in Puerto Rico. There's so much that isn't working. The power goes out all the time. Sometimes they don't have clean water. There's a lot of political corruption. There's a lot of violence, etc. So as they say, everything is a struggle in Puerto Rico. And that's what we wanted to represent by this wobbly silicone piece with the stack on gems on top of it that you have to push around without anything falling off. And to end, I just wanted to thank CAST at MIT and MIT Misty for providing funding for this project. Thank
you. So I oh, yeah. So speaking of just so people online can hear. Oh, yeah, okay. Oh, cheers. I guess I was just curious about what the political means in the game are that you mentioned, and how they work.
Thank you. So the way you play the game is that, to begin with, there's only one action that you can take. So there's a little bit of a skill tree that you have to unlock by making investments. And that action is to make an investment. Once you have unlocked more actions, you can, for instance, build up the educational system, which is my favorite action, maybe not surprising, but what that does is it makes all the other actions more powerful. And once you have built up the educational system and the infrastructure enough, then you can take an action to try to move the debt away from Puerto Rico and towards, metaphorically, Washington, D.C., where it belongs. And what happens then is that often when political change happens in Puerto Rico, historically, it starts at the universities. It starts with the students protesting, barricading themselves, etc. So it has a short-term cost to the educational system. It deteriorates somewhat, but you make the political progress, which is represented by pushing the tarp towards the edge of this white grid. And the black gems that you in the room can see on the board represent different political obstacles. So one of the actions you can do is to remove some of those black gems. In the rule book for the game, which is also a comic book that Rosa has drawn, we don't just teach how the game works, but we also give a little more background to the issue, but also talk a little bit about what has happened politically since we started making the game. So there has been some progress. Congress representatives have pushed for some debt relief, because claiming that some of the debt is unfair or unconstitutional, and won some victories. So that's what the pushing of the tarp represents metaphorically.
So I'm a little bit ignorant about Puerto Rico, but my understanding is it's some kind of special US overseas territory. It's not a state, and it never is allowed to be a state. So it's kind of like a colony. Is that so? Yeah. Okay. Sorry, man. Yeah. So how does this change or challenge the idea that it's still a colony?
So that is correct. I was more ignorant than you, I would like to believe, when I first started this project. I didn't know that Puerto Ricans don't get to vote in the US presidential elections, for instance. They don't have representation in Congress. So they very much are a colony. Um, there, there is a very complex uh, political struggle around the future of Puerto Rico in that regard. So the different local parties basically represent those who want to keep the status quo, those who want to become a state, and those who want independence. And it's very difficult to know what the right choice is. So Assyria, for instance, uh, thinks that the drive to become a state is a bad thing to do because that will cement Puerto Rico as part of the United States, and she wants them to gain independence. So they are split on this issue, and one of the prototypes that we made was based around this issue of the different local political parties wanting different things. But there is no consensus about what the best way forward is. But right here and right now, we are seeing Puerto Rico being hit by natural disaster after natural disaster, hurricanes, earthquakes, etc. So there's not really any time for them to work on paying off this budget. It's basically, it just needs to be removed immediately. And then there's a bigger question of the future of Puerto Rico.
Thank you. I was thinking about how are you thinking about this game? Is it a single prototype that you're using for research within the lab? Is it more of like an educational game that is intended to be applied within a classroom setting? Is there any intention to make it like maybe more market oriented, or how are you looking to apply it?
So right now, I consider this a high fidelity prototype. We've gone through a lot of prototypes, but it's still not finished. We have some issues to solve, and we have some solutions that we haven't implemented yet. But right now, it only exists in 5 copies. We have some funding internally from MIT to make more copies available for the MIT community. And we will do so once we have found a good publishing solution, which is hard when you start involving silicone components and neoprene mats and these kinds of things. So it's something we've been struggling with a little bit. But once that is done, I do want to take it public through a crowdfunding operation or something like that, but we would have to work together with the publisher to do that. And there are several who have shown interest to work with us on doing that. Yeah, that's a process that hasn't really started yet. Hopefully we can start it next year.
time for one more question. All right, I have a question then. So you mentioned that the kind of result of this game, one of the core mechanics, has turned into like an extremely frustrating style of mechanic, and frustration is like talked a lot about in like queer game studies or a lot of these kinds of queer readings of certain games. How much do you think the mechanic of extreme frustration is like really helpful or important for framing a game outside of hegemonic powers of normalcy?
What I can say, so we have play tested this on hundreds of people, mainly students, but also other visitors to the lab and at different game conventions and so on. And what grabs people, I think, is how they feel like they're getting a little glimpse on some kind of struggle in other people's reality. So I think for me in this game, that turned out to be very central. That's not where we started it, because we were thinking like we want to make something that is very inviting, easy to learn, kind of playable for all ages and so on, kind of going against our own sort of nerdy board gaming tastes. But we still ended up there where it's people wanting to leave the room when someone else has to push the tarp because they're so worried something is going to happen with the gems, or a lot of screaming and hollering. But I don't think we always have to go to that well, but as it happened in this project, that's where we landed. And now I see why that is discussed so much in the literature, because it really is what people have latched on to in the game.
Okie dokie. All right. I'm gonna stop sharing. Okay. Souvik, it is now your time. Let's see.
Yeah, just bear with me a second. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm here. Right. Here we go. So, is it okay if I start, Leland? Or
yep. Perfect.
Yeah, wonderful. So I'm going to talk about post-colonial play, and this is of course something that is a reprise of what I've done earlier. So you might kind of have heard some of this before, but it's also important that it comes in the middle where with Mikhail kind of presenting on Puerto Rico, and with Sarah and Souvik, both very close friends of mine, presenting right after. So I'm going to talk about discrimination, diversity, colonialism, and play, with more in connection with video games, but also kind of when we're talking about board games. And I know I have very little time, so I will start with this game which I've shown earlier, but it is like I never tire of showing this. This is the Monopoly version of colonialism. So it is kind of called this game of European kind of colonization, and in Africa. And you can see all these kind of African kind of regions, sometimes countries. They're all in the Monopoly, and you have fate and fortune cards, and you basically kind of colonize the whole thing. It was supposed to be. It was made in 1974, and there are obviously many other games which have board games which have distinct colonial kind of pedagogy, which is about colonizing and which glorifies colonizing. And then, I mean, no wonder that video games kind of like Age of Empires, Empire Total War, Europa Universalis, Europa Universalis, they kind of have this kind of similar kind of colonial agenda, and it's just kind of I would see a kind of straight kind of trajectory there. But then there is also the other kind of aspect where kind of games that were made in the colonies then were kind of taken to the metropole and they became something very different. For example, Gyan Chopar, which is a game about kind of learning about karma, rebirth, and kind of and basically Indic philosophy, whether it's kind of Hindu, Buddhist, or Jain philosophy, or even in certain cases Sufi philosophy from Islam. Then kind of go to the metropole, to Europe, to England mainly, and then kind of they become a Protestant kind of work ethic type game where you're kind of taught different values, but the ultimate game becomes a race game. So where the mechanic of the original game, the game ends at square 68. There are 72 squares, but you can overshoot square 68, and you kind of go round and round in the game until you kind of because it's about rebirth, right? But in the game that kind of we know now as Snakes and Ladders, which is now a children's game because now the Protestant work ethic has also given way to a more neoliberal capitalist ethic, which is again where the race remains, but the lessons, the life lessons, the pedagogy is gone. But it is more a game of competition where you kind of have you have children. It is a children's game mainly now, learning to reach square 100 first, and the snakes take you down, the ladders take you up, pretty much like what the earlier game used to do. So that again is a level of colonization. It's a level of colonization in which kind of you have the game's logic, the game's mechanic being colonized, being kind of taken over by Euro-American centric kind of thinking. But then we're not kind of really know of this really in video games very much, because there is this notion of kind of having everything kind of governed by technology trees, civilizations being governed by technology trees, and you see that sorry, I just kind of went to, yeah. So you see that this is the Indian civilization. This is the kind of and you have like certain elements. I mean, there were no long swordsmen in India, but then you have them here in the technology tree, which is everything is kind of built into a stereotype. So just as kind of Angela Cox comments that the game Age of Empires erases cultural distinctions, having most human units look the same. And then the buildings, as you can see, the Britons, the Celts, the Japanese, the Chinese, they have pretty much the same town centers, and with kind of advancing civilization, just the roofs become slightly different. That's about it. So again, kind of also there is this erasing of distinction between East Asian cultures in the game. So and then of course. This is always my favorite slide because I always love to think of this, because this is Dalsim. You might recognize him from Street Fighter 2, and he is presented in this very Orientalist way where he's wearing skulls and he has this yoga power. But the classic thing about his name is that his name is derived from Dal and Sim, which means sesame and kind of like lentils, and the people who thought of this name actually just went to the nearest Indian restaurant across the road and saw this name on the menu, and then they gave the name to this character. And his wife is, of course, called Sari, very imaginative because she's just wearing her name. So that, and then, of course, kind of scenarios like in Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, where you have the Russians and the Americans fighting it out in an Indian city and the Indian army is absent. Or kind of where you have a scenario like Civilization, which many of you have played, and you know that Gandhi is famous for one thing, which is dropping nukes, and that kind of it was considered to be a bug because it was apparently the mechanic was that kind of Gandhi's violence level would go to the negatives, and since the game couldn't deal with -1 or negatives, it just shot the violence level up to 100. But later on, Sid Meier's kind of autobiography has actually said that that wasn't true. Really, there was no bug, and it was just kind of made like that anyway. And it gets kind of borne out by the fact that in the later Civilization games, the bug wasn't kind of obviously correct. Sort of the bug wasn't really rectified or kind of changed, but it was kept around because it was thought to be a cool thing. And it's kind of also kind of reflective of how kind of colonialism views anti-colonial resistance, especially resistance which is kind of not of the kind that of the same kind or in the same kind of violence or kind of pushing back resistance in the way that kind of let's say the colonial powers were used to it, because Gandhi, after all, was kind of practicing what he called non-violence and civil disobedience, which was quite difficult in certain respects for them to deal with, and you can see the fear that you see you can see the fear in Winston Churchill, then Prime Minister of England, of the UK, of Great Britain rather, who's kind of looking at Gandhi as seditious and as a fakir, half naked, who was kind of striding up the viceregal palace. So he's finding it kind of really difficult, and that this bug actually kind of, for me, signifies this kind of colonial unease with kind of such a and I'm really surprised that this I'm surprised but not surprised to see this unease actually being carried forward even into video games, like many decades later, after India has become independent, and pretty much colonialism is kind of a much criticized topic right now. But nevertheless, this just continues. Actually, Churchill actually once commented privately to a friend that he was afraid. He was actually glad that Gandhi didn't use Zeppelins. So you can see he was. I mean, the whole idea of this nuclear Gandhi would have been there in the colonial mind, or the colonizers' minds in that sense. But then there are also kind of ways where you see the kind of there is an attempt by kind of games to try to address colonialism, and which fail miserably. And you have here Lara Croft kind of in the shadows of the Tomb Raider, and she goes to this kind of South American village, and she's kind of trying to rescue the people there from. But ultimately, you see that she takes everything, all the artifacts that she finds, and she doesn't really bother to return them. She's after a Tomb Raider. And then ultimately, I mean, despite her good offices and efforts, basically the entire village, which is supposedly resisted Europeans for a long time, just is decimated pretty much because of her interventions. And here you see Lara Croft wearing a native mask to blend in. But it's this whole idea of identity tourism that Lisa Nakamura talks about, where she sees characters like Lawrence of Arabia walking into an Arab costume and then saying that he's Arab, or Rudyard Kipling's Kim kind of walking into a kind of an Indian boy's costume and then kind of claiming that identity. So this identity, this taking on an identity as if it's tourism, is something that kind of is pretty characteristic of colonialism, and also that certain kind of games that try to kind of address issues of colonialism and say that let's kind of this is such a bad thing, and we are going to address this in our game, counter this. Also in board games, as Mikhail and Mary Flanagan have written, I mean, it's just kind of they just end up perpetuating ideas of colonialism, and just as this game, I mean, which some of you may have seen or may not have seen, Slave Tetris. It's called playing colonialism. So it's supposed to be a game which was about teaching how kind of African slaves were treated, or their kind of predicament when they were shipped to America, and you can see them. But to play Tetris with them, just to show, just to pass on this message again, and the way they have been depicted as well is well, I think very, very problematic, and the makers of this game had to withdraw the game. But I'll just leave you with the visual, which is, I believe, shocking enough. So again, the whole idea of trying to address colonialism in games, but then not being sensitive enough, because there is a hard-coded colonial thinking, I'd argue, a bias that is already always there, which needs to be addressed first. But of course, there are in games there are of course instances of counterplaying dominant discourses, as Tom Apperley, who's there among you, and Emil Lundgal-Hammar have already mentioned in their writing, and there are kind of games like Muriel Tramis's Freedom, which is a really early work, which is kind of addressing issues of slavery, and in creating this kind of scenario so that people can understand what slavery was like, and or, for example, there are more direct kind of even more direct kind of messages. I mean, Ian Bogost calls this procedural rhetoric, and the procedural rhetoric of this game is basically it turns over space invaders. And then it's just showing Native Americans kind of shooting aliens, and you know who the aliens are. And this is by Elizabeth Laponzi, and she makes this game and she calls it Invaders. So there are these instances of counterplay, and also even more subtle counterplay in the sense, against the game from India by Studio Olio Mingus. It's called Somewhere, and this is about kind of a game where this colonial official discovers these people who are in this city, which he's found this hidden city, but the people do not speak because they're afraid that their words might penetrate the layers under which their bodies are hidden. So it's a comment on post-colonial nationalism. Somewhere reveals that fictions construct the reality around us, while its mechanisms show that other people's fictions can infect one's own sense of the self. So it's this fear of kind of this how kind of colonialism can infect and change, basically, and again kind of in this sense, and then these people don't speak, they're rendered subaltern because they're afraid that if they speak, they're this kind of they're going to be made to speak a language which is not going to be theirs, and it's going to change them. So that fear of the colonized is kind of embodied in this kind of very voiceless game. I mean, you just go into this extremely surreal landscape. If you see, this is available free on Steam and online. If you play this, it's just kind of this surreal landscape where you move through this very, very kind of strange, fragmented world and try to make sense of it, but then probably can't. Of course, there are also other examples where, I mean, one we see that kind of game designers try to kind of bring other realities, and especially in her recent kind of talk that she gave at Bloomsbury India, this conference a couple of years ago, maybe 3 years ago, Meghna Jayant, who is the designer of 80 Days and many other games, Sunless Seas, which you might know about. She talks about how kind of video games are by default constructed around being around the barrel of a gun, basically, and she calls it white protagonism, and basically, and she says that why cannot we think of other ways of kind of other ways of designing video games, other mechanics where it's not about kind of capturing territory, which is not about kind of moving through territory and with a gun, or how about kind of talking about kind of other alternatives, other kind of scenarios where we can redress issues of colonialism, sexism, and racism of the period. And she says, why not have women invent half the technologies and pilot half the airships? why not shift the balance of power so that Haiti, rather than barely post-bellum United States, is ascendant in the region? Why not have a strong automaton using Zulu Federation avert the scramble for Africa? So then she's like talking about characters who play with gender and sexuality without fear of reprisal, and women, people of color, queer people, minorities. And she says that the fantastical bit in the game is that they're often allowed to have their own stories without being silenced and attacked. Just as you have the people in Kaimgad in the previous game not speaking, they're already silent because they're afraid that if they're not silent, their identities are going to be taken. Here, of course, Jayant wants to give the people who are otherwise silenced to be able the ability to tell their own stories. And like I always say, that it's not. I mean, the subaltern doesn't speak not because they can't speak, but they don't speak because they can't be heard. And that is what Jayant here kind of lets the player do to make the subaltern heard. And then kind of because I started with board games, I want to also go back to ways in which we can counterplay colonialism in board games. And this is a game called The Irish Game by Brenda Romero. And here she actually shows that you're playing the Irish, so you've already lost. And this game is about kind of basically these white cubes and green meeples, and then this orange cube. So if you have an orange cube, it pushes the other figures into the adjacent squares, and the white and the green meeples, they can occupy. They can actually be squished into one square. 4 of them can be squished into one square, and the orange cubes kind of keep occupying the space. And when these they cannot be squished, when these characters, this white and green, they cannot be squished into the squares, then they're thrown out of the board. So this is actually, as Brenda explained, these figures would be shipped to Barbados to serve as slaves. So, and I wondered how many families split up, how many lost parents and children to slavery, and whether the English officers felt any remorse for their action. So, and you can see that Prendergast here in his justification for the Cromwellian settlement, again, colonization of Ireland, is saying that this was a measure beneficial to Ireland, which was thus relieved of a population that might trouble the planters. It was a benefit to the people removed, who might thus be made English and Christians, and a great benefit to the West India sugar planters, etc. So, kind of this game actually kind of points out this issue of kind of colonialism as using board game mechanics, but it's also kind of actually speaking to how history was constructed, and it's a powerful kind of message that it sends here. And then, I mean, I want to end with the fact that there has always been games and toys that have been kind of resisting colonialism, and this is, but then they've always again been co-opted by colonialism and then kind of changed. And this is the story of Tipu's tiger. Tipu Sultan was a monarch, was a king in southern India who fought the British, and he was quite a pain in their neck, really. I mean, so for a long time. But he had this toy built where actually by French engineers and Indian craftsmen. So this toy would show this tiger jumping on this British soldier, and it would kind of emit rasping noises, or some kind of. There was an organ. There was a machine used that was wound up inside the tiger. So. And apparently people used to go to so when Tipu was defeated, this toy was taken away by the East India Company, the British, and exhibited in their museum. And apparently people used to go there to see the toy, and they would faint. But the classic thing is that now the toy is in the Victoria and Albert Museum. And I actually saw a video of the curators of this museum, playing "Rule Britannia, Rule the Waves" on the organ inside the tiger. So it's kind of a classic kind of example of how the what could be a post-colonial toy is again, or what could be maybe an anti-colonial toy is kind of treated in this post-colonial world, and it's a complicated thing because then you have the colonial powers again playing their own music through it. So I'm going to stop here. I'm just kind of wanted to basically give an overview of kind of how kind of colonialism works in video games and how its antecedents are there in board games and kind of in basic and there's basic colonial thinking in some of the planning around these games, really, some of the thinking around these games. So yeah, so thank you all for listening, and I look forward to Souvik and Sarah.
Great. Thank you so much. A round of applause. I think we have time for at least a couple of questions. If there are any questions, also anyone online, feel free to put them into the chat. Yeah. Do we have any questions? So yeah, I have a kind of a question. So it's a lot of your discussions, which are great and clearly on topic, were very kind of like colonial or anti-colonial is the way I would describe it. Is kind of games that deal with these topics at all kind of always in this either like defined by these power dynamics, or have you seen any kind of designs of games that deal with I don't know, subverting the colonial structures without being the strict opposite approach? Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. If we are talking about kind of video games, I would say that somewhere the game that I showed earlier would be actually kind of a good example where kind of it's not like directly anti-colonial. It's very, very subtle in the sense that that the characters that are portrayed, they're kind of they're just kind of voice. They don't speak. They refuse to speak, and it's kind of how this refusal is actually a kind of a pushback to the colonial idea of kind of basically European cultures kind of just taking over and replacing kind of other, just like I showed you with the Snakes and Ladders game, how it comes, and then now Indians themselves, they've just played Snakes and Ladders. They don't know about the Yan Chopar, most of them. But so that's the somewhere game that is kind of creating this level of a kind of pushback. But there are, of course, other board games. I mean, I've been told about this game called Spirit Island, which has it's quite interesting because it has it's maybe like something like the Settlers game, like Catan or other games, where apparently settlers try to come and settle in the game, but then the island itself, the players, it has kind of natural forces which resists in different ways. Now, I'm not sure if that is kind of also not directly anti-colonial, but kind of that's how it's been described to me. I haven't played it yet, so I do wish to play it and check it out. But I would look at kind of, for board games, I would look at kind of games which question the fundamental ideas that are very Eurocentric. So I would like to, you mentioned anti-colonial, post-colonial, and I did as well, but I would also like to bring into the equation the word decolonial, which is something that Walter Mignolo talks about, which is about questioning the very basic kind of premises of truth that are actually very European, but then they're supposed to be considered kind of universal. They're not universal, and when you go back and challenge these premises, and I think if we are looking at board games like that, that would be really cool. I can't think of an example of a board game like that. I mean, Brenda Romero's board game is, of course, pretty interesting because it highlights the problem, and it doesn't really go for offering a solution. It just kind of shows what the problem is, and that is kind of quite a reality, really, in the scenario of colonialism. So yeah, so that's I don't know. I'm not sure if that answers your question really, but yeah, I would say that more board games with more subaltern, subtle mechanics would be board games and video games.
All right, one question from chat. Thank you for the lovely talk. I'd read your text, Video Games as Minor Literature, reading video game stories through paratexts. Do you think for games based on cultural and regional stories, the paratext could extend far beyond the game manual, cutscenes, etc., the existing media around these stories? Would it be possible to subvert, challenge biases, or should the existing paratext be utilized as a supporting element?
So I wouldn't go for thank you, Bhavya, for that question. It is kind of something I'll think about more and maybe respond to you at length. But speaking off the top of my head, I wouldn't look at any shoulds for either the paratext. But I do have a chapter. I do have a paper on maps as paratexts, as post-colonial paratexts, basically, and how maps basically, on the one hand, they kind of they actually extend the colonial kind of ideas in the games, but on the other hand, how they also always already subvert some of these colonial ideas. So, but what you talk about is games based on regional and cultural stories, the paratext extending the game beyond the game manual and cutscenes. I would say that often the play of the games, let's plays, then kind of walkthroughs, then not walkthroughs as much, but maybe after action reports, and the player's experience often also kind of serves to subvert the biases in different ways. So that's kind of a very quick thought. I'm not sure I exactly answered your question, but yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. We are going to move forward. There is one more question in the chat, so feel free to use the chat to look at that if anyone has a response to that. Yeah, so Souvik, Kar, and Zara, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
So thank you. Let me just display our presentation. Okay. Yeah, I think the ongoing presentation, yeah, I think we set it close or something like that.
Did you have a question, Souvik? You're a little quiet. Is there?
Yeah, am I audible?
Souvik, yeah. Would you mind unsharing your presentation? Yep.
Yeah, I'm trying to share my presentation, but I think the ongoing presentation, presentation needs to be.
Very good. Makes sense.
Right. So is this visible now?
Okay. Yes.
Yes.
I hope. Right. Let me just put it on slideshow. Right. Fantastic. All right. So I would like to begin by thanking Learn and the other organizers here from Tampere University for inviting Zara and me to this research talk. A shout out to Samuel Pulin for conveying to us the opportunity to come talk about a special issue of Press Start here. A warm thank you to Souvik Mukherjee too, who is present here and whose Board Games Museum, curated with his wife, Dr. Amrita Sen, has been featured in an interview in our special issue. So in the interest of time, let's quickly jump into what we want to talk about in this very brief presentation on our special issue for Press Start, which we titled The Playful Postcolonial, Culturing Video Games in India. This is how we have divided the presentation. We introduce the background and context of the special issue and then give you a brief idea of India on the game studies map. Then we display a timeline of the issue and briefly discuss the articles and general themes of the articles in the issue. We then talk about the two other genres of academic writing featured in the issue, a book review and an important academic interview. The first of its kind, barring the journalistic interviews of Dr. Souvik Mukherjee and his wife, Dr. Amrita Sen's Board Game Museum in Kolkata, India. We round off the discussion with brief comments on the implications we envision for the special issue. I will now pass on to Zara to tell you about the background and context, which informed the call for papers for the issue. Over to you, Zara.
Thank you so much, Souvik. So I'll dive right into what really was going on behind the scenes. And unfortunately, it's not as magical as one would imagine. Um, it was a while ago, actually, around Feb 2022, and a lot of things were going on in the game studies scene in India during that time. It was around 1.5 years of um, Digra India being on the map in game studies, and we were trying very hard to really establish what it means to be a collective of mostly PhD students. Professor Souvik Mukherjee was the only non-PhD scholar on the Digra India board. And even though a lot of interesting work was being championed and platformed by Digra India, there were not a lot of avenues for showcasing such work in terms of scholarly publication. During this time, I had probably just finished working on two edited collections for a very different scholarly approach to globalization. And a lot of our contributors were younger scholars who were talking about some of the same things that Digra India was also talking about: participatory literature, e literature, um, video games, board games. And working on those two edited collections, I just knew that there is a need in the spaces of journalistic publication to really platform young voices from India. And that was when I randomly DM'd Shovikor, and we do this all the time. We randomly DM each other ideas, not really realizing how far those ideas will go. And this is one of the ideas that really took off and so beautifully. In terms of conceptualization, we really started very simple. We wanted an avenue for showcasing upcoming work in game studies from India that would also have connections with the rest of the subcontinent and game studies in global south. Why an India specific guest issue particularly? At that time, there were no India specific game studies uh, journal issues out there. Uh, this is now one of two in the area. The other one is actually co-edited with Souvik Mukherjee. So, yes, I guess we have all the co-editors of India-specific guest issues on the panel right now. And what this has done, especially this issue, is that thanks to the kind of work Press Start particularly platforms, it has really made PhD scholars and grad students be a part of this flourishing academic genre in India and South Asia, which is why I suppose pitching to Press Start was a no-brainer. Um, for those who might not be as well acquainted, Press Start is a journal that platforms and showcases submissions from undergraduate and postgraduate students. And they're very multidisciplinary in their approach to the kind of publications that they showcase. And this really worked for us because game studies in India is very multidisciplinary, informed by issues of both varying and diverse cultures, but also language, issues of digital divide, and so on. So we needed a home for the kind of collection that we were imagining that Press Start was able to really deliver to us. Before we move on to the next slide, we do have a screenshot from a Museum of Dubious Splendors, which is a game from Studio Olumingus. We don't really need to talk about it because Souvik Mukherjee has already done a great job. Studio Olumingus is really one of those games that has become central to a lot of work from Game Studies India because they speak to the changing nature and topography of game studies in India. And you'll always find Studio Olumingus at some corner of any work that we're trying to talk about. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this issue, once we began to really draft out the CFP, we realized that our goal was to situate India on the game studies map. To begin with, this meant actually acknowledging that what was originally called the sleeping giant of the gaming industry, India was actually waking up to the discursive possibilities and critical engagement um, of what it meant to really talk about games in India, which already had complex and diverse gaming cultures, both unique in their experience and informed by the intersection of class, gender, religion, caste, and more. An intersection that is widely impossible to understand outside the context. And this was the context that we really needed to bring forward to make sense of India on the map. We really wanted, as part of the conceptualization of the special issue, to formulate the strong affinities that gaming cultures and games in India have with the rest of South Asia and the post colonial global South. Obviously, we were building up on a lot of theoretical work by Souvik Mukherjee and Emil Hamar, for example. But at the same time, we were acutely aware of how there is a huge paucity of in-depth scholarly engagement with video games in India, both produced within the country itself as well as globally, that draws on particularly non-Western, specifically Indian cultures and geographies. And this is probably where we wanted this special issue to veer towards. And I think we have had a bit of success, at least on this. Finally, we try to keep the calls for papers as open as possible, inviting, engaging, and encouraging questions about India on the game studies map. In the early stages, the CFP showcased a list of themes, not really limited to the pointers on screen, but these were post colonialism in video games, game design in India, representation of India in video games, gamers and gaming cultures in India, history of games in India, analysis of specific Indian games, platform debates in India, video games, social media, and the Indian cyberspace, situating play in India vis-a-vis play in South Asia and the global South, identity politics in video games, and game studies in India. I now pass the mic to Shovik Kaur to give us a timeline of what really happened once the CFP was published.
Right. Thank you, Zara. So let me just go to the next slide. Yes. So this is the broad timeline for the issue, which took about 2 years to produce. So we published the CFP on 24th August 2022 with the abstract deadline of 3rd October. We received quite a large amount of abstracts, which took a while to process. And we finished selecting our prospective articles by February 2023. I remember us agonizing over the whole selection procedure because so many abstracts had come in. And yeah, it took a while to sort of make up our minds on, as happens with all editors, about which to choose and which to leave out. But anyway, so the articles then started coming in and went through multiple rounds of revisions, rigorous peer review and edits. Now, these were one of the most important challenges we faced for the special issue, which unfortunately pushed back the expected date of publication by a few months. However, we believe that the rigor of Press Start only helped to better fine-tune the articles and help them reach their fullest potential. So in hindsight, the delay may have helped enrich the issue even more and the articles it featured. So I will now pass on to Sarah to tell you about the articles that are featured in the issue.
Thank you so much. I think the biggest challenge we faced with this issue was really trying to fit in as much as possible while also making sure that all of the contents really speak to each other and give a really colorful picture of what it means to study and do game studies in India. Which brings us to some of the contents that are there in this special issue. And apart from our editorial, of course, which you can really skip because we've spilled all the secrets here already, we have two really amazing scholarly articles. The first one is Fleshthetics of the Post-Colonial Body, examining contested identities in the works of Studio Oleomingus by Soham Adhikari and Oritro Bhattacharya. And the second one is Enter the Backrooms of Tatvabhumi, an educational game for middle school students in India by Chaitanya Solanki and Deepak John Matthew. Both of these articles take off from the initial themes of our issue, which can be broadly thought of as video games, post-colonialism, Orientalism, games, colonialism, play, representation, identity, culture, and so on. But what these articles in particular did to these bigger themes was situate them in specific venues of game studies in India. The first one began to talk about flesthetics, plasticity, and the body with respect to memory poetics and chrononormativity. It is one of the most exciting articles we've read till date, and I cannot recommend it enough. To give you an idea, it's a direct and robust response to the central question of contested identities and phantom histories that inform game studies in India and the global south. Through an in depth analysis of Studio Mingus's games like A Museum of Dubious Splendors, in the pause between the ringing, the indifferent wonder of an edible place, the uncertain repetitions of truth, and folds of a separation, Adhikari and Bhattacharya present a novel theorization of the post colonial body and its plasticity to explore what they call fleshthetics. This article presented a potent way of reading post colonial reality and the affective subjectivities it symptomizes and enriches post colonial investigations within and beyond game studies. On the other hand, Solanki and Matthews Enter the Backrooms of Tattvabhumi is a document journaling the game development and the design process that went into creating the author's educational game Tattvabhumi. The game, which aims at teaching chemistry concepts to middle school students in India, is also used by the authors to discuss and illustrate their criteria for assessing the effectiveness of multimedia design, namely technology selection, task analysis, content representation, and interactivity. This article provided an engaging framework for studying games and applying design criteria to ludic production in the education center. Over to you, Shoik.
Right. Thank you. Let's move to the next slide. Yeah. Uh, I'll pass it over to Sarah to tell us about the process for the interview, which was very interesting.
Yeah, sorry, I was muted. Right, correct, you are. Um, this is probably the most fun that Shankar and I had while editing this special issue because we are such huge fans of the board game in question. Um, in curating a board game museum in India, we became excited interviewers and interviewed board game collectors and scholars Souvik Mukherjee and Amrita Sen. This is an interview that really took us back to some of our origin stories of Digra India, really, and conceptualized itself as an Adda style interview. We delved deeply into understanding the geopolitical dimensions of creating, curating, and studied board games in India, all from the balcony of one's home, which is what Mukherjee and Sen have done. They gave us a really detailed account of what the museum means to them and their visitors as a space that represents the past, present, and future of board games and play in India. This interview, we hope, brings to the readers a material history of a games archive in India through practice and play, showcasing the interconnected nature of board games in India and the global south. Shobhik Kaur has actually been to the museum, something that I've missed out on. So if you all have any questions about how it feels to really visit this museum, he's your guy for it. On that note, over to you, Shobhik.
Thank you, Sarah. It was certainly a fantastic experience visiting the museum. Uh, but yeah, I'm here to also talk about the book review that we featured in our special issue. So one of the earliest decisions we took regarding the issue was that we would also call for book reviews of scholarly work from the subcontinent, so that readers would be treated to a snapshot of the ongoing scholarly work in a subfield. Shammo Roy's book review of Souvik Mukherjee's Video Games in the Indian Subcontinent, Development, Cultures and Representations appropriately rose to that demand. Shammo discusses Mukherjee's immense project of studying the gaming culture in and of the Indian subcontinent. So Roy's initial comments are structural in nature, which discusses the book's three sections on development, cultures, and representation. So before engaging with Mukherjee's reference to Adrian Shaw's very famous question in 2013, how do you say gamer in Hindi? Which becomes a deeply charged quest that underlies much of the book's central argument. Through this review, Roy engages critically with Mukherjee's book while also responding with a repartee of his own, questioning what it means to look for South Asian alternatives to standardized norms within game scholarship. Now, to briefly, so these are just some parting thoughts with which we wish to leave you as we wind up. Hopeful remarks, really, about what we expect as the implications of our special issue as it goes out to thousands of game study scholars and millions of non-expert readers in the world. Our objective was producing a small but colorful snapshot of India within the larger map of game study. And so this special issue is meant as a beginning for more vibrant games research from India as part of the networks of South Asia and the Global South. The experience of collating and editing this special issue, for which we heartily thank Prestart and Samuel, was an enriching experience of conceptualizing and producing a diversified academic collection straddling multiple genres of academic work, focusing equally on the diversity of positionality, context, and specificity to address the complexities of gaming cultures in India. And we hope, rather ambitiously so, that this will stimulate similar future collections, edited volumes, graduate conferences or workshops in tandem with Digra India Game Studies India Adda conferences. And finally, I must again draw attention to the Adda rather than interview that we had with Professor Souvik Mukherjee and Amrita Sen that we hope helps to expand and develop further the critical contours of the genre of Adda in conceptualizing such academic collections. So thank you again. Thanks to all.
All right. Thank you very much. All right. I think we have maybe a couple of minutes for questions. Anyone who is online, once again, feel welcome to put in questions into the chat. I can start. Do you have a question? Fair enough. All right, I'll start off with my question. So if you were gonna kind of name your greatest surprise, maybe when you were in this process or after this process was done, what do you think was your kind of greatest surprise compared to what you expected during this?
Souvik, do you want to go first?
You can go ahead.
Right. I think the thing that really pops out and will forever remain in my memory is how we never expected two grad students from India, Adhikari and Bhattacharya, to actually take this very simple CFP and conceptualize plasticity and fleshthetics. Fleshthetics is a new concept, and like I said, I can't recommend this paper enough for really providing us with a framework for not just studying post-colonial bodies within video games, but even beyond. And I think that is something that will forever remain the most exciting part of working on this special issue, chancing upon work that is truly path-breaking and being able to provide a home for that work. And we're already getting to see how fleshthetics is taking off as a concept in game studies in India, and hopefully it goes across borders and does hugely successful things beyond it.
Right, just to sort of piggyback on what Zara just said, one of the things which actually sort of excited me very much was the fact that once the papers started coming in, we could sort of see how they, in their responses to the call for papers, was actually were all in conversation with each other. So we could actually see the papers as a part of a network which was sort of coming up. Now, since most of scholarship from India comes out in game studies, usually comes out as separate articles in like individual journals or as books, we usually do not get to see special issues dedicated only to India. So we were very much aware of the fact that what we were doing was something that was so new, and the fact that all these articles written by people who haven't much interacted with each other except at conferences, sort of all coming together in conversations, that was something which was very interesting to see from the other side of the table as an editor. So that was something very exciting, that this is something which is happening, which is sort of coming up right in front of our eyes. So that was a very interesting backroom experience.
Yeah, we're usually very modest, but I think Shovik and I truly believe that we are seeing history in the making in front of our eyes. The presentness of history really is so fun and exciting to see.
Great. That's awesome. Other questions, either online or in the room? Yes. All right. We are near the end of our time. So thank you very much. Let's do another round of applause for our four presenters today. Thank you so much for everyone coming. That is the end of our Games and Colonialism talk. Please be aware we have our next research talk in January on games, playfulness, and mental health. So thank you very much. We'll leave the chat open for just a little bit of time and we'll close it down, and we'll see you all next month.